New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hey there, this is Ruth Miller, and we are here with New Thought, Roots and Branches. And as you'll see in the first slide, we're going to be talking today about one of Phineas Parkhurst Quimby's students, Warren Felt Evans. Most of us have never heard of him, and that's totally appropriate. But if you were around in the 1880s, you would have been hearing about him because he had a lot of books out there, and it was the only material that was in print prior to 1886 on the subject outside of Christian Science literature. So we're looking at, in the next slide, a man who was born in 1817. And I'm going to back up. You're absolutely right. We're going to look at this whole field of roots and branches. You can see that there's a lot of different things feeding into Dr. Evans and Reverend Evans materials over these previous years. We're looking at that first episode that was addressing those ancient teachings. And then our second episode that was looking at the European Enlightenment. And then we talked about Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson in the States, and how he learned about all those things and connected with a lot of those people. And then Phineas Parkhurst Quimby, who pretty much all by himself came to understand how it is that the mind and body are connected and how our beliefs can lead to having symptoms in the body. In the next chart, we get to look at the incredible breadth of people that we will be talking about as we go forward. Almost everyone on that chart is coming up in the weeks and months ahead. And as you can see, very near the top up there is this guy named Warren Felt Evans. The next chart shows us a photograph, the only photograph that I've been able to find of this amazing being. I think it's fascinating to see someone who worked for 25 years teaching this material pretty late in that process, along about 1888. So, but finally, now let's look at Evans and his life. In the next chart, we learned that he was born in 1817 in Vermont. He was the sixth of 7 children. He went to a place called Chester Academy, and he went to Middlebury College, which some folks around taking this class or listening to this show may possibly be familiar with. But then he went to Dartmouth College, which a lot of us are familiar with. And in fact, my daughter just got entered. She got accepted, there we go, into a master's program there. So Dartmouth is a very real thing in my life right now. While he was at Dartmouth, some of the work that he saw was by a bishop in England, an Anglican bishop, whose name is pronounced George Berkeley, if you're British, not Berkeley, Berkeley. And Reverend Berkeley, or Bishop Berkeley, was beginning to say that the way that the Roman Catholic and even the Anglican Church, the Orthodox churches, were teaching what was being said and taught by Jesus wasn't exactly what had been said and taught. And that a lot of what they were depending on was what the Apostle Paul was saying in his epistles, his letters. And as a result, a group of people under John Wesley had broken away from the Anglican and Catholic tradition to form the Methodist tradition. So in 1837, thereabouts, in that year while he was at Dartmouth, Evans converted to being a Methodist minister. Now, again, this connects with my life, which is kind of cool. My grandmother's father was a professor at Princeton between about 1860 and about 1900. And during that time, he was a Methodist minister. And the way they worked it, as you can see, is they had different charges, that is, different clusters of Methodist churches where everyone was a member of the church, and then the clusters would meet in various places. So what Reverend Evans did when he became a minister in 1839, and after he married Miss Tinker in 1840, is he became a circuit riding preacher. That is to say, he would start off very early on a Sunday morning, and he would speak in one Methodist congregation, and then he would go to another one and speak there, and then he would go to another one and speak there. Someone might feed him somewhere along the line, and then he would go to another one and speak there. And over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, he would cover his whole 11 charges. And that lasted until 1863, very shortly after the war between the states began. It also lasted until he had physical issues. And as you look in the next slide, you'll see that Evans was not entirely healthy during this time. Now, part of it may have been that lifestyle. He began to think about what is the healing process. Now, Methodism doesn't really directly address healing, but throughout the New Testament, we run across, and often in the Old Testament, if you know where to look, we run across texts that suggest that it's possible through a spiritual process to heal a body, one's own or others. You know, Jesus obviously was quite the healer, also Elisha and Elijah. So this notion that it was possible for the body to be healed through a spiritual process opened up all kinds of possibilities. So in 1860, before he's actually retired from the ministry, we see in Warren Evans's journal, "The Lord is my strength. He is the health of my countenance and my God. I will find in Christ all that I need. He can cure every form of mental disease and thus restore the body. For disease originates generally, if not always, in mind. I lay hold of Jesus as my life and salvation." Well, this is an amazing piece of writing. It did happen after Quimby had begun writing newspaper articles, and it's possible that Evans had learned about Quimby's thinking and adopted the thinking by 1860. But in the next slide, we'll find out that in 1863, Evans began to shift the way he was thinking and actually visited Quimby. So let's look at what he did in 1863. You may recall that we talked about Swedenborg way back when we were talking about the European Enlightenment. In 1777 through 1840, Swedenborg was an engineer becoming a mystic and writing about the presence of angelic forces on the earth and about the living aliveness of heaven and of hell, and the possibility of perfection into union with divinity, which was all very unlike what was being taught by the Methodist Church at the time. So he left the Methodist Church as he began to study Swedenborg. And part of Swedenborg's idea that he channeled through the angels that he was experiencing this information coming through from, the idea that a body can be understood as the expression of the soul and the mind. That was a very different idea. So Swedenborg introduced a little bit of what it was that Evans was beginning to move with. And I think it had to do with He wasn't feeling very well. There's the quote there, a nervous affection, not affliction, affection, complicated by a chronic disorder. Of course, he would never name it. Well, later, he wasn't going to name anything he didn't want to see more of, because that's part of the principles he was teaching. If we look at the next slide, we can see some of what he has said about that experience in his visit to Quimby. 25 years later, in 1888, Julius Dresser, who I mentioned last time when we were talking about Quimby, Julius was one of the homeopaths who studied with Quimby and inherited Quimby's manuscripts. So 25 years after Evans has visited Quimby, and 21 years after Quimby has passed on, Dresser tells us, so readily did he understand the explanations of Quimby, which his Swedenborgian faith enabled him to grasp the more quickly, that he told Quimby at the second interview that he thought he could himself cure the sick in this way. And Quimby agreed. So, in the last point there, Evans' first attempts on returning home were so successful that the preacher became a practitioner from that time. Now, Julius Dresser's grandson, Horatio, is the one who actually printed the Quimby manuscript materials much later, almost 40 years later. But Dresser was still actively involved in helping people understand what it was that our friend Phineas Parkhurst Quimby had been doing. So when people wanted to know whether Evans had involved himself with him, they turned to Dresser to find out. But it turned out that very same year, in a journal, as you'll see in the next slide, later comments by Evans, it was interviewed by Swartz in Chicago. Now, Swartz is interesting. We'll learn more about him when we talk about Emma Hopkins. He was publishing something he called the Mind Cure Journal out of Chicago. And Evans told Swartz in an interview that he had called twice briefly on Dr. Q in Portland, Maine, nearly 25 years ago, so 1863. And his interviews satisfied him that his own methods of cure were like those which Dr. Q employed, which is to say, they may have overlapped a little bit, but they had pretty much independently developed their own methods. Now, Swartz added that Evans spoke well of Quimby, and of all the workers, that would be the dressers and people around him, simply desiring all to be honest and to give credit where credit is due. And that is so hard. And in 1888, that would have been about the time that Mary Baker Eddy, who we'll also talk about later, was saying, oh, no, I invented this all by myself. And we'll find out that, well, not quite. All right, in the next paragraph, we find out that in that very same issue, the Mind Cure Journal, Swartz says that Evans told him recently that he was passing through Portland nearly 25 years ago. He called upon Dr. Quimby in the United States Hotel, which was not where Quimby's offices were. Quimby's offices were in Belfast, but he had clients in Portland. And when he went to Portland, he would stay in the hotel. So Evans went, quote, to ascertain his methods of treatment and that he found them to be like those he had employed for several years. That would have been the years between 1960 and 1963. Now, Evans, as you saw by how many colleges he attended, was an avid student. He loved to read and he loved to study. And I'm sure he spent hours poring over the Swedenborg material. And he probably spent hours poring over Goethe's material and the other Enlightenment writers. And we know he had to have studied Ralph Waldo Emerson, because when he was growing up, Reverend Emerson, the Reverend Mr. Emerson, was one of the most important speakers in the country. So Evans drew on a lot of other people's teachings, developed his own methods in that year, or those years between 1860 and 1863. And you look at that very last line, which was a mental process of changing the patient's way of thinking about disease. So important. This is what New Thought is, isn't it? Changing the person's, our own, or the patient's, or the client's, or the parishioner's way of thinking about whatever the issue is. And that's part of why we call it New Thought, isn't it? If we look at the next slide, we begin to see how it was that Evans became a practitioner. So in 1863, he was in his own home, outside of Boston, and he was working in his own home. But in 1867, he opened an office in Boston with his wife, Miss Tinker, and the two of them practiced this healing method. And they taught all the time. And this was an interesting approach. They saw the healing process as a learning process. They were teaching the principles as they were helping people heal their bodies. Then they moved to Salisbury in 1869, and they received patients in their homes. So they closed the office, and their home in Salisbury became sort of a sanatorium. It was a house that had a bunch of rooms, and so people could stay for a few days or a few weeks while they were learning this new way of thinking. And they had remarkable success. As I say, Evans was a prodigious reader. Well, he loved to write as well. And he had written several books while he was a Methodist minister about the presence of the divine and the love that is always with us. But then as he was working as a practitioner, he began to actually do talks and then write those talks up. So people would come in groups, or small groups or large groups, learning this method from him, and then he would write those up. Another thing that Evans established, which had not existed prior, was he never charged for their services or their instruction. People were invited to provide free will offerings, and no one was ever turned away for any reason. Whatever they could offer, that was good enough. And if that wasn't anything right now, well, something might come later. And they did that for 20 years, from 1869 to 1889. I'm guessing they had kind of regular office hours because, as I say, Evans became quite the writer, as you'll see in the next slide. These are some of the things that he has written about this process. First of all, he is saying this is not a new revelation, as we've already found in this particular series. And he calls it the old philosophic idealism. We talked about it as Neoplatonism, but Plato suggested that there's an ideal form that exists permanently, and then there are temporary forms of the ideal that show up in matter. So the ideal exists in some realm outside of matter, and the form is a temporary, imperfect representation of the ideal. So he is saying, Evans has studied this, and he says that it is the old idealism, the most ancient and most spiritual philosophy of mankind. Well, he was an anthropologist. He was not. He was no kind of person looking at other cultures. He was looking at the history of Western civilization, which for most people began with the ancient Greeks, and Plato was the primary writer of that period. But then he talks about how more recent people have talked about it. In that second point, he says the best exposition of this in modern times is in, oh my goodness, there's that Bishop Berkeley again. So he was converted to Methodism by Berkeley, who was saying the model that we're working with as Orthodox, Catholic, Anglican Christians is not adequate. We need to expand the model to recognize that love is always present, that the Christ as love is alive in us. Those are some of the ideas that Bishop Berkeley presented. But then Evans goes on to say that Fichte, Hegel, and Schopenhauer were also good writers, good explainers of these ideas. And most of those were translated into English by the mid-1800s. If you look at the third bullet on this page, and this is, I think, an important one, the fundamental truths and practical principles involved in the cure of ourselves or others by I love this word, the phrenopathic method. Phreno means skull. So looking at what's wrong in the skull, phrenopathic method, are extremely simple and can be learned in a short time. So the principles and the truths are simple. And then he says in the next point, under certain conditions, and that's important, and in a state of what he called intercommunion of mind with mind. And Thomas Troward will tell us more about that in weeks to come. The thoughts, the feelings, all the operations of one mind are transmissible to other minds. Okay, so under certain conditions, in a state of consciousness in which we are connected at the mental level, the thoughts of one person can be transmitted to another. The feelings of one person can be transmitted to another. And the operations, that is, whether I think this way or whether my mind works that way, can be transmitted. Now, you may recall last week when we were talking about Quimby, he learned as he watched his hypnotic subject, Lucius Berkmar, sit on the stage, absorbing Phineas Quimby's thoughts and acting on them, that Quimby got this message. Well, Evans also took a look at hypnosis, or at the time called mesmerism, and saw that was the case as well. He did not use it in his practice any more than Quimby did when Quimby started practicing this method. But knowing that it was possible and knowing how it could be possible, well, we all know what we believe is what we begin to experience. So this is a huge part of what we're talking about here. So under certain conditions and in state of intercommunion of mind with mind. So that was his aim when someone would come to him as a practitioner. He would go into a state of mind under conditions. Now, I'm guessing those conditions, based on what all of them had said, were they were in a private space. There were no distractions. The person that was there was ready to experience something like healing. And the person who was the practitioner was not being involved in some other kind of thinking and some other set of concerns. So those would be the conditions. Then that state of intercommunion of mind with mind is possible through hypnosis, but it's also possible, we've found in many modern experiments, simply by holding positive regard for the other person. It's amazing the physiological reaction or responses in a body that is separated from our body when we think positive thoughts about it. There have been experiments done at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. There have been all of those thousands of double-blind experiments around prayer and healing, where literally, if someone is given a first name and is willing to consider the possibility that when they consider and think positively about someone, that someone will be affected, it happens. Physiological shifts happen. And so those are the pieces that Evans began to realize were necessary. And then he laid out the basic philosophy in the last point on that Thoughts on the Process page. As all life is a manifestation of the one life, the individual spiritual state affects the whole. But in a greater degree with those who are in direct connection with us. So whatever I am experiencing spiritually will affect all beingness. And if there is someone I am directly connected with, either because we're in the same room or we're holding the same ideas or we have loved each other or any other connection, I will have a greater influence on them as my spiritual experience is shifting. So those are some of the things that he said in some of his books. And if we go on to the next one, next slide, he talks about the two absolute essentials for anyone to be healed under any circumstances. First is a desire to get well. And many of us have encountered people who did not desire to get well. They said they did, but it didn't serve them for whatever reason. Not being well gave them a better payoff than being well, right? So there has to be a clear desire. The other, he said in that second bullet, is a faith in the efficiency, or we would say efficacy today, of the remedial, that is the remedy agent, the remedial agent, the remedy. So we have to have faith that this thing is going to work. Well, that's the placebo effect, isn't it? Doesn't matter whether it's the drug or a sugar pool, like that, sugar pill, a drug or a sugar pill. If I think it's going to fix me, that, and I have the desire to be fixed, then my body will respond appropriately and the symptoms will no longer be there. And sometimes they'll be gone forever. But he points out in the third bullet, without these two things, the cure of disease by any mode of treatment is, to say the least, if not impossible, exceedingly difficult. Now, we've all met people who, for whatever reason, it served them not to be well. It gave them a story about themselves that they identified with, or it gave them relationships with other people that they felt served them, whatever reason. And so it really doesn't matter. You can do the surgery, they'll turn around and come back with something else. You can do the drugs and they won't be as effective. Any number of things. It doesn't matter the method if these two things are not present. So if you are working with or have ever tried to work with anyone in this mental healing practice and you're going, how come I'm not getting results? Well, you might consider the possibility they don't really want to be well. They don't really want, for example, to have, their finances cleared up, because it serves them in some weird way to think of themselves as impoverished. Or they might not want their relationships to be healthy because it serves them in some way to think of themselves as victims. So you know what you want to do then? Yeah, you got it. You want to work on that story about who they are rather than on the illness itself. Yes? Let's look at the next slide. What we're going to see here is just about how busy the man was as a writer. Most of the words that you've seen on the screen that are his quotes are from one or another of these books. As Julius Stresser put it, Dr. Evans's 6 volumes upon the subject of mental healing have had a wide and well-deserved sale. And that was published shortly after Evans passed on. His first book was The Mental Cure, and he was, I love this, that the subtitle is Illustrating the Influence of the Mind on the Body, both in health and disease, and the psychological method of treatment. Now, 1869, he was beginning to overlap with William James and the emergence of psychology in the US. The next book is called Mental Medicine, 3 years later. He saw that as carrying the material that had been introduced in the first book to the next level. And the same thing with each of the following books, Soul and Body, taking it to the next level, talking about what is soul. The way I talk about soul is kind of like what Evans had in mind. Spirit is unchanging. Spirit is the one spirit. And the one spirit individualizes, and as the DNA and the energy of the one spirit work together, then a soul begins to form. So the soul is like the interface between the spiritual self and the physical self, right? So soul and body are working together in soul as being emergent from the body's interaction in the world with the spirit's energy, etc. So he's talking about that in 1876. In 81, he says this state of being that we call cure, that is being healthy, is a divine law. It follows divine law. This is not something that is a quirk. This is what the universe is designed to do. If you buy that there's a designer, and you don't even have to buy that there's a designer, you don't have to think about a designer, just be aware as the laws and principles that lead to this marvelous universe in which we can exist include that health is our normal state and that everything is working toward our well-being, which then he goes to talk about in 85 that not only is it our normal state, but it can be found in lots of places. He's begun to study other cultures and other peoples and seen that the cure is present in many different ways of being. And then finally, he ties that into Christianity in the esoteric. Some of you may be familiar with not Thomas Huxley, he was a biologist, Aldous Huxley, the humanist psychologist almost, who wrote The Perennial Philosophy in 1948. And he was pointing out that in the esoteric, the inner hidden portions of all the religious traditions, they're all the same. It's only the exoteric, the outer portions that are interfacing with culture that we see cultural differences. But esoteric Christianity then is that aspect of, or that way of understanding Christianity, that deeper Christianity, when you go into the core of it, that will always show up as, "Hear, O children of the one, there is only one, and I am," right? And in that place, then these things that he's calling mental therapeutics become quite clear once you start thinking in those ways. So on the next slide, you get to see the title pages of a couple of his books, the first one, The Mental Cure, and the last one, Esoteric Christianity. Both of these are photographed from the Harvard, not the Dartmouth, the Harvard Library, which is amazing to me what they're willing to hang on to. I have PDFs of these original texts, and I made copies of their photos for you. Again, he's a 19th century writer, and most of us are not going to wade through his language. Most of us are not going to try to follow his thinking, but they are available. And I got PDFs thinking maybe I would do what I normally do. Some of you are aware that I have translated from 19th century writers quite a bit of the teachings and the essays that they have written. So these two books, these are the first and the beginning and the end of his writing career on the subject of mental healing and what we would call New Thought. They're not all that big. They're, not maybe half-size books, a little bigger than our normal trade paperback. Well, if we look in the next slide, we see that in 1889, he passed on, which is part of why Esoteric Christianity, that came out that year, was his last book. But what was really interesting is thousands of his copies of his books were going out. His first one, I'm going to back up a slide to look at those again. The Mental Cure book, that one went into 16 editions. That's pretty impressive. Esoteric Christianity didn't get it quite so many because he wasn't alive and doing the teaching, but it was a lot of editions. So if we go forward to the slide with the passing on, they were continuing to be sold long after he passed on. 10, 12, 15 years, they were being advertised in the New Thought journals all over the country, and people were buying. I am guessing that his wife outlived him and probably made sure those ads continued, and that may have been part of how she supported herself. What is very interesting, they didn't create any kind of institution, no kind of organization, no kind of structure. They treated and trained thousands of people. I have no idea how many because they didn't keep any records. Unlike Quimby and unlike the others that we'll be talking about, we don't know. But we do know that at least several hundred people were writing about dozens of other people who had been involved in Evan's offerings. So the reason you probably never heard of Warren Felt Evans is because, well, he didn't create anything that lasted, but these books became the basis for almost all New Thought activity around the country between about that first one, 1869, through almost 1915, prior to World War I, actually. So can you imagine, from the Civil War to World War I, just about, Evans was the known person for this material. Nobody ever heard of Quimby in those days unless he referred to them. I think that's fascinating. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means that we're not part of something that's just started. This is not some new age phenomenon. It means this is something that has been standing the test of time. Between Quimby's work that started in the 1850s and Evans' work that started in the 1860s, based on ideas that had been around for a couple thousand years, wow, we have something that's pretty fantastically well established. And both of these men had the experience of people in 1 to 6 sessions, depending on the nature of their issue and the nature of their belief. But between 1 and 6 sessions, getting over whatever the symptoms were that caused them to come and join the process of mental healing with Quimby or Evans. And in the meantime, in the background, we have the dressers. Again, they did not track the number of people that they were treating, but it lasted for 3 generations. Julius Dresser, who worked directly with Quimby, his son, who got to experience Quimby, and then his grandson, who wrote up the works of Quimby. They were continuing to do this work for 3 generations under the name of homeopaths. So that was perfectly fine. You know, chiropractors and homeopaths and naturopaths who use all kinds of methods. Yep. And that was what was going on then. Wow. For us today, then, that realization that the patient, the client, the person has to be ready to experience healing and believe in the efficacy of the treatment is huge. Then the realization that we have to enter a state of consciousness. It isn't just words. It's a state of consciousness in which we feel that connection with the power and the presence and that way of being that is not here and now and material oriented, feeling that spirit moving in us and through us and around us, and then also feeling the connection, knowing there is a connection, claiming the connection. We use the words to get to that state of consciousness. So if you've been trained in any of the healing prayer treatment methods, be aware it's a way to get to the state in which you get to experience the results as someone showing up symptom-free. We particularly can see that in the life of Nona Brooks, who I think is about 6 or 8 people down the line here as we continue this class and this series. So I'm going to invite you this time to step outside of your normal consciousness when you think about someone. When you hold them in positive regard, think about the connection between you, how your minds are already interconnected, and you are seeing them as well and whole and healthy. I used to tell mothers who were concerned about their children, hold them in the light and love them. Yes, feel that love and hold them in the light. It was amazing how in a matter of weeks, sometimes months, but usually weeks, things would turn around with their children, right? Same thing. You're feeling the connection between you. You're aware that life, love, light is the only reality. And you let yourself feel that and know that. Then you just allow the process to do the work. There's no need to make a particular thing happen. Notice when he was saying these factors are necessary, not once did he say, You have to impose your will on another person. Oh, no, 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 no. That's not what we're doing here. And not once did he say, you have to convince them that it doesn't exist, that it's not real. No, we don't have to convince them of anything. They've already chosen to be healed, chosen that it's possible to be healed through this treatment. And whatever form of healing, which means make whole, right? Whatever form that is, with whatever set of symptoms that is, we do these things. We enter into that state of consciousness in which the connection is real and we know the truth, the higher truth of their well-being, regardless of what they have said about where they're at, or what they have thought about where they're at, or what the people around them are telling them. A diagnosis, I'll go ahead and give you that in this one. A diagnosis is the opinion of someone who has been trained to discover what is wrong with you and then to prescribe a treatment. That's what a diagnosis is. It's an opinion. That's why you get a second or third opinion. It's based on a mental framework that says there must be something wrong with you. And all the tools and all the tests are designed to do that. Now, many of you have shown up and you've gone through some series of tests or whatever with a professional medical person in whatever version of the field that was, and have them look at you and go, you're remarkably healthy. And it's almost like you've been an affront to them. How dare you not have something wrong with you, right? Well, in mental healing, we assume not that there's something wrong with you, but that everything is right with you. And some glitch has happened in the system between the brain and the body, that we're just going to bring back around to the reality, the norm, the divine law that says healed, whole, and healthy is normal. That being well is who and what we truly are here to be and do. Yes? So that is what we have to say, and we will end with the last slide as usual about this incredible man, Warren Felt Evans, and his marvelous wife, who opened her home to this practice and was willing, between the two of them, to never be paid for any of their services, but to accept only love offerings. Up to now, and for many people after this, people charged a fee just as if they were, a different kind of medical practitioner, but not the Evanses, and who were willing to be there and teach and teach and teach again for all of these people who were just discovering the possibilities of this new way of thinking, just discovering that, wow, you mean it's possible to be well? I don't have to hurt. I don't have to have these symptoms, regardless of what doctors had told them. You may recall with Quimby that when he was diagnosed with consumption, he had many doctors giving him different medications, and then he had kidney issues from the medications that the previous doctors had given him, and doctors were telling him that they couldn't fix that. But it took someone named Lucius, his student, his hypnotic subject, after they were no longer in a session, not in the hypnotic state, took Lucius saying, I can fix that, to cause Quimby to realize, something else really is going on here. And it is. And we all have this capacity. And that was one of the things both Quimby and Evans realized. We have it to the extent we're willing to believe that it's possible, and to the extent that they're willing to enter into that state of interconnectedness of mind with another person or group of people. I think that's just wonderful, don't you? All right, well, that's what we're going to do for today. Thank you so very much for joining me. It's a real treat to share with you the lives and teachings of this marvelous group of people that have formed this movement we call New Thought. Join me next time for New Thought, Roots and Branches.